This is probably the most requested deck I've had on the channel, going all the way back to Prop 15 decks. People really wanted to see a Sabrina's Alakazam deck, and I couldn't find all of the comments, but most recently I did have requests from Nick F, Giuseppe Bellini, and PTCG Team Dark. And this deck took a lot of playtesting because Sabrina's Alakazam has this power Psylink that gives it a copy of every other attack that's on any Psychic Pokemon you have in play. And there's a lot of Psychic Pokemon to try and test this thing with and see what has the most synergy amongst all the Psychic Pokemon that you could potentially have on your bench. For example, let's look at Base Set Ghastly, which is one of the Psychic Pokemon I did playtest in this deck. Those two attacks were pretty terrible at the time that they were released. No one ever really wanted to use Base Set Ghastly. But consider if these attacks were transplanted onto a Sabrina's Alakazam using Psylink. Destiny Bond could be pretty scary to a deck in this metagame like Metal Chansey, where if one attack is going to knock you out, that completely wrecks the strategy that Metal Chansey goes for. Sadly, Base Set Ghastly did not make it into the final cut of this deck, but what I have to present instead is what I think is the most solid, rounded out set of Psychic attackers with the best attacks that you can transplant over onto Sabrina's Alakazam. So let's just jump right in and talk about them. So we are going to start out with Sabrina's Abra. There are 3 different Sabrina's Abras that you can use in this deck. I opted for the one that has 50 HP rather than the 40 HP on the other 2 versions because you could be potentially using the attacks on the Abras as Sabrina's Alakazam. A lot of people do opt for the Energy Loop Sabrina's Abra, but I tend to go with the safer option, which is 10 more HP. Sabrina's Kadabra itself has a pretty useful attack in Life Drain. It only costs 1 energy and it makes a really great last ditch attack if you don't really have enough energy to pull off a bigger attack. So for that reason, I'm doing a 3-3-3 line of Sabrina's Alakazam. No Pokemon Breeder in this deck. Setup isn't really a problem. Even without Cleffa in this deck, you probably noticed that I didn't start with a Cleffa for once. While Cleffa was great for early game setup, I found that after I retreated it for an attacker, that it was taking up some pretty precious bench space where I would want to lay down some more Psychic Pokemon. And so I decided to just take it out, and the deck actually ran a lot smoother without it. I just replaced it with more copies of Professor Oak and Elm. That way I could still get a pretty fast setup early on, and it actually benefits this deck a lot more to start attacking very early on, and that really throws your opponent off. If you are discarding Psychic Energy with a Professor Oak, and then you start the game with Mewtwo using Energy Absorption, you've already got a great setup on turn 2 or 3 of this game. So while your opponent has probably been using Eek a couple of times and they've cycled through more cards than you, you've already got a pretty great Haymaker Pokemon already set up in either Promo Mewtwo or in Mr. Mime. Now, Promo Mewtwo I think is the best Psychic attacker in the game up until this point. Aside from Wigglytuff, this is my favorite card from Base Set era, and it still lives up to its name in Base Neo. And Mischievous Night Eyes attack is amazing in this deck. For 1 energy, you automatically put your opponent to sleep, and you really force them into a position where they have to think fast, or else you're going to use Perish Song on them, and that Pokemon's going to be gone. So just having a Mischievous on the bench with Sabrina's Alakazam active, your opponent has a lot to think about, and they really have to rush to try to figure out how they're going to retreat this Pokemon that they have active, or how are they going to get a Double Gust. And Perish Song does cost 3 energy, so it may seem pretty hard to pull off, but you have to remember that Sabrina's Alakazam is also going to have access to Energy Absorption off of that movie promo Mewtwo. So having that Mewtwo in this deck also helps protect against energy removals and super energy removals, because it gives you an easy option to get those energies straight back onto Sabrina's Alakazam and make sure that it stays a threat. And Mr. Mime not only provides a great attack with Meditate, which can really help stack damage and escalate what Sabrina's Alakazam can do, but it's also a great switch in for decks that only have heavy hitters. So if you want to swap in a Mr. Mime on a Metal Chansey, or on a Feraligatr, or on a Sneasel, you can absolutely do that, and they're not going to be able to do anything to it unless they can shut down its power for a turn. So for that reason, I really struggled. I wanted to include 2 copies of Mr. Mime in this deck, but I think 1 copy is enough just for those very specific scenarios. Got the 2 Oak, got the 2 Elm in here to help with setup. If you are having trouble getting that early setup, just throw another copy of Professor Oak in here. That'll help tremendously. But got your computer search, that way you can discard Psychic Energy for your hand for an energy absorption setup, but also just to search out those exact Pokemon that you want to get down on your bench, or to search out just maybe a Focus Band or another utility card that you really need for that moment. Getting a Focus Band on a Sabrina's Alakazam is pretty important so that you can continue to use your entire toolbox of attacks. Also got Pokemon Trader in here because you do have such an array of Pokemon. Most of them are basic, so you don't have to worry about it too much, but if you do find yourself in a pinch where you need that Kadabra or you need that Alakazam quickly, you can just use Pokemon Trader and trade maybe one of the Mewtwo's in your hand. This deck also plays heavily into bench rotation, so it's not only moving around your Pokemon, which can be difficult since they all do have retreat cost, especially Alakazam, it's got a retreat cost of 3, but Gust of Wind is going to help pull out easy targets on your opponent's side of the field. Double Gust is going to do both of those things at the same time, but they're all going to be situational. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're like, oh, well actually I can get a Mischievous combo done really easy on this Chansey that has no energy on it, I'm going to go ahead and whip that thing out and start getting this combo going. Or there may be a Pokemon that's already got some damage counters on it that got retreated to the bench. You can get an easy kill off of that by just pulling it out with a Gust and then using Meditate. There's just so much you can do with this deck, but it does kind of pivot around your ability to move around your own Pokemon and your opponent's Pokemon into very advantageous positions, very much like a base set era deck. 4 copies of energy removal to help make easy targets of your opponent's Pokemon as you're moving them around. 2 copies of Nightly Garbage Run, because it's a lot more important in this deck to get specific Pokemon out of the discard back into the deck so that you can search them out. So if you're having a really great time and winning the game off of maybe that Mischievous Night Eyes combo, and that thing gets KO'd, you need to get it back as fast as possible. Sprout Tower is in here as a bit of a niche stadium for when you are coming up against Wigglytuffs and Chanseys, but the one that you're mainly going to be using probably is Resistance Gem, because they're all of these normal types and dark types that have a resistance to the psychic typing. But the rest of the deck is going to be filled out with Psychic Energy. You don't have to worry about including too many of them because you do have the ability to recycle them out of the discard with not only Garbage Run, but also with Mewtwo's Energy Absorption. But with this deck, I found that the ideal starting position is to start with either a Mr. Mime or a Mewtwo that you can put as your active, and hopefully you can also get a Sabrina's Abra to get down onto your bench. That way you can go ahead and Oak and or Elm into a brand new hand and potentially get your Kadabra that way. Get some more basics to go ahead and lay down and get your setup. It's a pretty simple setup. From there, just attack for a couple of turns with the Mewtwo or the Mime while you're getting Sabrina's Alakazam fully evolved up on the bench. And then, whenever you feel the time is right, you swap into Sabrina's Alakazam, toss a Focus Band on it, and start using that Psychic Toolbox. Now we'll look at some of the Psychic cards that I did try in this deck that did have some effect and worked okay, but didn't really fulfill the entire potential of the final lineup that I have in this video. The first of which was base set Alakazam. Because of the Wizards of the Coast rulings, you could run lines of Alakazam and Sabrina's Alakazam because technically they did have different names. Base set Kadabra and base set Alakazam both have some pretty useful attacks that can hit pretty hard, plus you have the added benefit of Alakazam's damage swap ability, which works really well in tandem with Focus Band, because if you do get reduced to that 10 HP, you can move all of those damage counters off onto another Pokemon and just keep attacking with Sabrina's Alakazam after that. But Base Neo is really more about getting those one-hit KOs, and so damage swap never really got utilized all that much, and even when it did, I didn't really feel safe spreading those damage counters around anyway because I didn't have any ways to heal them off. There's not a lot of other Psychic Pokemon that have high HP, so you can't really bank it onto them like you could a Chansey and then use Pokemon Center. I mentioned earlier that there are 2 other Sabrina's Abras that you can substitute in other than the 50 HP one that I use, so some people do think that the Synchronize or the Energy Loop is a great trade-off for that 10 HP, since in Base Neo you aren't really worrying about your basic Pokemon all that much. Because setup is so important, you do have a few turns to go ahead and evolve them up, but just for me, I prefer to have that 50 HP. I don't think that Energy Loop or Synchronize are all that useful for a Sabrina's Alakazam to use, so it's just all personal preference really. I know that some people will be disappointed that Rocket's Mewtwo is not included in my deck list, but Drunk Shuckle, it has 3 attacks. That adds 3 more attacks to the Psychic Toolbox that you can choose from to use with Sabrina's Alakazam. Well, all 3 of those attacks are pretty mediocre and not very useful. Juxtapose does work pretty well with Focus Band, but just because there's a coin flip, it's just almost wasting a turn most of the time. Hypnoblast is pretty decent, but Mischievous is way better and for less energy, and because Cyburn uses 4 energy, you're almost never gonna use it. When playtesting with Rocket's Mewtwo, Juxtapose was the only attack I ever really opted to use off of the card, and when I did, it was as a last-ditch effort, which, you know, I already had other cards that I could try to work with better than just flipping a coin and taking the chance on moving some damage counters. Generally speaking, this card just gets overhyped a lot because it has cool art and it was the first card to have 3 attacks on it, but all in all, not a very good card competitively. Dark Hypno is a card that I did have some success with because it's got that great Psy Punch attack that you can deal some easy chip damage for only 1 energy if you've been hit with some energy removals, and also bench manipulation can come in really handy against decks like Wigglytuff and Sneasel. The main problem I found here was that because it is an evolution card, having both Drowsy and Hypno in the deck did overcrowd it and overcomplicate the deck just a tad too much. This deck just operates more cleanly and crisply when Sabrina's Alakazam is the only evolution you have to worry about, and the rest of your setup is just laying down basics onto the bench. Even though this was a request deck, it was a deck that I did plan on uploading later anyway because it is a competitively viable deck. Although it will probably fall somewhere more into the tier 2 range, so it's not going to be winning a lot of tournaments, but it still does have the potential for some placings. And the Psychic Toolbox title on the deck is just something that I added. I've never really seen this on any deck listings as anything other than Sabrina's Alakazam. And there is such a potential for this deck because you can interchange so many different Psychic Pokemon and use so many different attacks. I would love to hear from people down in the comments that have ran this deck or that have their own personal build that they like. Any specific Psychic Pokemon that they like to run that I didn't include in my build or discussion. Also, let me know what decks you want to see next or what kind of content you'd like to see on the channel. If you want to find me on Instagram, you can get to me at Drunk Shuckle, and I will see you guys next video. Bye.